Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I will be talking to author Aimee Fleming about her new biography coming out on the 30th of June 2025. Tudor Princes and Princesses, the early lives of the children of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. Aimee Fleming is a historian and author. She lives in North Yorkshire with her husband and 3 children. She studied history at the University of Wales, Bangor, and then later completed a master's in early modern history at the University of York as a mature student. She has a passion for history, particularly the Tudors, and worked for over a decade in the heritage industry in a wide variety of roles and historic places. Let's get into today's episode. Hello, Aimee. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. So we're here today to talk about your book coming out next month on the 30th of June, and it's all about the early lives of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York's children. The Princess Margaret, Prince Arthur, Prince Henry, Princess Mary, and a few others as well.
Yeah, there's a few others in there as well, but they're the ones everybody knows. So we've got a few little babies in there as well, which is it's sad but kind of nice at the same time that there was lots of them.
Before we get onto that, I thought, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, so I'm Aimee. I'm mum of 3 boys. I studied history at undergrad level at Bangor more than 20 years ago now, which is a long time. And then I also did a master's as a both a part-time and also mature student. So I did that once I'd had my children. I've worked in museums and heritage basically since I left school, on and off, and my background is a lot of heritage, history, visitor attractions, things like that. So that's where I come from. So when I'm talking about history, I tend to talk about it from a sort of visitor kind of perspective.
Before we get on to the children, I thought we could talk a little bit about Henry VII and his wife, Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about them and who they were?
Right. So Henry VII, obviously we all know sort of his kingship. But what you have to understand is that Henry VII had a really unusual childhood. He never knew his father. His mum remarried very early on, and he was left in the care of his uncle. And also, because his uncle had to run away because he was a political refugee, he was left in the care of the person that had taken over his uncle's position as Earl of Pembroke. So he was left in the charge of William Herbert, and it's an unusual situation because he's this noble boy, but he's away from all of his family, he's away from everybody that he knew. And it wasn't until 1470, when Henry VI came back to the throne very briefly, that the family was sort of reunited, as it were. And at that point, Henry's childhood, you could kind of say that it became a little bit more normalised very briefly. And then when Edward IV came back onto the throne, he had to go into exile with his uncle. So he had a really unusual background. And he hadn't really experienced England, as it were. When he was a child, he'd lived in Wales, and then he went to France. So he didn't really know England, or what it was to be a royal, or what it was to be part of that royal household. Because he comes into it at quite a late age, when he's 28, when he finally becomes king. He has spent all of his life away from the English throne. He doesn't really know what's expected of him or what to do. That's almost the exact opposite for Elizabeth. She is a royal princess. She's been brought up around everything to do with the royal household. She's the eldest daughter of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville. She, apart from that brief period again in that 1470-71 when she was living in sanctuary with her mother, she was princess of the realm. She was in palaces, she had all the education, all of the refinement. It's almost the exact opposite of what Henry VII experienced. And I think that they played off one another because of that when they were married. Now, their relationship is, I think, it's as happy as you could expect it to be. Is probably the best way to put it. It's a situation that they're brought together, and because of their sort of ideas of duty and what God's got planned for them and England expects of them and things like that, they sort of come together and make the best of what they're given. But they do appear to have been quite connected with one another, quite loyal to one another. They looked after one another when the children died and things like that. And one of the things that I always like to talk about when I'm talking about their relationship is the fact that medieval kings, their responsibility, when the queens were pregnant, they were responsible for the confinement, the sort of preparations and the planning for their confinement. And Henry went all out. Whenever Elizabeth was pregnant, he would just whatever, blank check. She got all new bedding, all new clothes. She got, I mean, some of the things that he bought for her were bizarre. Things like, I'm not sure why you would want 2 saddles, not 1 but 2. But equally, you know, he would bring in food and he would bring in musicians and he would bring in the finest of everything he could. And I think that for me speaks volumes as to what he thought of her. It was the one way that he could show that what she was doing was important and that she was important to him. So it's a nice little look into this little window.
Yeah, I think they had a really loving relationship. Obviously, it might not have started like that, but as you were saying about the confinement and stuff, it's he did quite a lot for Elizabeth, I think. Like obviously it's you'd hope in 2025 a husband would do a lot for a wife, but
Yeah, but I think,
16th
like you say,
century.
yeah, he wasn't. I don't think he was expected to be a sort of hands-on dad or a hands-on husband, even, you know, because it was more a sort of political and there was reasons behind what they were doing. But I do think that they would have relied on one another because they were at the top of the tree and they had nobody else that they could really rely on. And if they didn't have faith in one another, then who did they have faith in? And Henry's his reputation for being suspicious of everybody has come down through the ages. You know, we know him as being this sort of just generally suspicious kind of a character, but he never seems to have been worried about Elizabeth. There's never any questioning about her loyalty or about her position in the royal household or anything like that. They are an item. They are a team. And I think that does span down into the children as well. They come across as a sort of team Tudor, so to speak, which I think is quite a nice sort of, you can see that there's a family loyalty and duty, and it goes beyond just, oh, we're king and queen. It's a holistic thing for them.
What was Henry and Elizabeth's relationship like with their children? Were they quite good parents, so to speak?
I think they were. I don't think they had a lot of time. I think it's the same as any busy family household now. They're both working hard. They've both got responsibilities. There's expectations on them and on the children. But there's evidence to suggest that both Elizabeth and Henry had involvement in who was staffing, who was looking after the children, what the children were taught, what clothes they were wearing, what food they were eating, what money they had to spend, what events they were taking part in. So it wasn't necessarily that they were reading them a bedtime story every night, but there was something there. They were proud of these children, and these children were an investment piece for them. And they wanted to show them that they were important, both in both directions. I think the children needed to be shown just how important they were, but equally, I think that they wanted to give these children are they're part of the crown jewels. They're the dynasty in waiting. There's lots of poetry written about the children when they're born and things like that. And it goes all the way through their lives that they were the king and queen were king and queen of England, but they were also king and queen of this little household, and their children were devoted to them and they were devoted to their children.
Yeah, I think that obviously a parent had very different kind of role in the 16th and medieval period, especially. Like today, we're quite hands-on, and that's kind of expected. Obviously, a good parent would be considered good education, set them up for life and that kind of thing. But I think because of both of Elizabeth and Henry's upbringing, because obviously Elizabeth had quite a turbulent upbringing because she was in the middle of the War of the Roses. So I think she wanted to bring stability, whereas Henry kind of wanted to show them love because obviously he wasn't with his
He
mum for
didn't
so
have
much of
any of
his
it.
life.
No, he didn't have an example to follow. Elizabeth was really lucky in that she had this big extended family, and there was Woodvilles coming out of the woodwork, and she had lots of siblings, and her mum and dad were there, and she was able to have this big nuclear family experience, but it always had this undertone of it could go away at any moment. Whereas for Henry, he didn't have that, but instead he had this, well, I don't know what's going to happen next. So they both had this uncertainty growing up. I think the thing that I always wonder is that when you look at things like nowadays, if you have an example as a parent, you sort of, oh, I'm going to do things differently. I'm going to do things a bit different, and I'm going to change things. It was even more difficult for a royal parent and a noble parent, because these expectations to separate from your children and to not to spoil them and not to give them too much, and to have them experience things so that they're able to deal with everything. It gave them this removal, and I don't think either Henry or Elizabeth wanted that removal. They followed the examples, but only to a point. And you see that with all of the children. They do things just slightly differently, and they have more involvement than their predecessors did.
So their first child is Arthur. So when was Arthur born, and do we know much about his christening?
Arthur was born in the September 1486. So they had been married in the January, and then he was born in the September. So there's some argument as to whether or not he may have been a little bit premature, or if the dates were right, maybe they'd sort of already been living as man and wife prior to a full-on ceremonial wedding, so to speak. They wanted to get a jump start on starting off this dynasty sort of thing, because that was what had expected to happen. It'd been the plan all along that he'd marry her, so maybe they'd done that. But whether or not, there's another reason why they think he was early, is that when he was born, there was plans afoot as to how his christening would happen and things like that. But all of the key people that were supposed to have been at his christening were not there. And he was born in late September, and his christening happened about a week and a half later, which normally it would be sort of 3 or 4 days after. But the Earl of Oxford, who was Henry's right-hand man, was in his farm in Suffolk. So he was literally on the other side of the country from where Arthur had been born in Winchester. So they obviously weren't expecting him quite yet for that to happen. But no, regardless, they managed to get everything together, and this christening was a massive affair. So his whole birth, in fact, was massive. It had all been planned for massive symbolism, and this whole thing of Arthur being born in Winchester, which was believed to be Camelot, and how he was the next King Arthur. It was all symbolically all linked together. But they made it even more so by having this elaborate christening procession through the town and announcing his birth. And there was huge parties and feasts, and the whole city of Winchester took part. There was bonfires on every street, and they made it into a event. I mean, they had planned this to the nth degree, and this is what I was saying about Henry going all out, because he planned to have Elizabeth go into confinement and to give birth in Winchester. That he had put every egg in that basket, that they were going to have a little boy and it was going to be Arthur and everything was going to work out. And it did, which how often can we actually say that happened in the Tudor period? It never normally happens. But everybody took this as a sign that this was a divinely ordained match, marriage, dynasty, kingdom, whatever you wanted to put onto it. And his christening was massive. They erected this big pedestal in the middle of the cathedral, and there were banners with all the Tudor regalia on everything. And it was this massive announcement that an heir had been born to the Tudors. This was right. That's that box ticked. We are now we're good to go forever and ever now. That was the end. That's the end of it. And they stayed there for 6 weeks to keep, so that they could build on this and keep going and keep having these celebrations and things like that. So they really did go all out for Arthur. They really did.
Where was Arthur's household as a baby slash, growing up? Was he with his parents, so to speak, or was he taken to Ludlow straight away?
Right, so like I say, the first few weeks he was in Winchester with Elizabeth. They all stayed as one big household. But after about 6 weeks, the whole court moved back to London. But Arthur was set up at Farnham Castle in Surrey, which is about a day's ride from most of the palaces in the middle of London. But it's far enough away from the city that you would clean air, and it's safe, and it's a secure environment for him to be raised in. And they set him up with his own household, nurses, security, cook, whole works. Not that he would have needed one, but he had one from day one. And he was set there until he was about 3. When he was 2 and a bit was when Princess Margaret was born. And at that point they decided, okay, he's at 2 and a bit, he's old enough now to be Prince of Wales. So take on that responsibility. And it was at that point that plans started to formulate for him to then move to Ludlow Castle, which is traditionally where the Prince of Wales would have lived. It's where Elizabeth's brother, Edward V, he spent a long time out there. It's where his preparation to be king took place. So it was the natural progression that he would be set up in Ludlow. But this is where Henry and Elizabeth did it slightly differently. They did send him to Ludlow, but they sent him with a big household, including Jasper Tudor. Beloved uncle, very trusted, had raised Henry for the sort of formative years, his teenage years, and had looked after him, had been his sort of mentor. So they sent their precious firstborn son out into the world with Jasper Tudor, and they sent him with all sorts of other tutors and things like that. And he was given every single thing that he could have been given. But that, for me, him being sent with Jasper shows just how much they trusted Jasper and how much he was part of their family. Yeah, that was his sort of line all the way through. He stayed at Ludlow until his death. So that was his home. That was where he spent most of his time.
What education did Arthur receive? Was it different from his siblings?
I would describe it as the same but different. It was the same sorts of things that he was being taught, but it was for a different purpose almost. Because he knew from the day one, basically, he was supposed to be King of England. He was taught everything that a King of England was supposed to know. So he had tutors. He was given tuition. He was given almost an apprenticeship in politics by being out at Ludlow, following the Council of the Marches and things like that, following Jasper. But he also had tutors who were more modern in the topics they were teaching. Bernard Andre is the famous one that taught Arthur for most of his teenage years. And he brought in this humanist sort of side of things, but he didn't have as much of it as his his brother and sisters did, because obviously he had this overriding goal of making him into a king rather than making him a fully rounded sort of princely character. But that he did learn languages, he did learn classics, but there's some some bits and bobs in there that sort of suggest that it doesn't come naturally to Arthur. He was more practical. He did learn languages, he did learn things, but he didn't enjoy it very much, and he would often take 3 or 4 attempts to do things, whereas Henry particularly seemed, according to the things we have, he was quite a natural at these things. He enjoyed the sort of the classics, the languages, the poetry, things like that, whereas Arthur was much more practical about the approaches he took. But yeah, I think with Arthur it was more of an apprenticeship than an education. I think that's the difference. It's a subtle one, but it is a bit of a difference.
Because, as you said, we know that Arthur, from the day he's born, he knows he is going to be succeeding his father as king when Henry dies. Was Arthur betrothed to anyone very early on in his childhood?
From almost from day one, I think there was a plan. Right, we need to get him a good wife because he's going to be a good king, sort of thing. That was the plan all along, and it doesn't really take long. If you think he was born in the September 1486, by the middle of 1488, the Treaty of Medina del Campo had been signed with Spain, and as part of that, there was a marriage alliance with Arthur, and it was intended for one of the daughters, but most likely to be the Infanta Caterina, who's Catherine of Aragon. But there was always, there are some sort of sidelines that suggest that, you know, if she didn't survive, then another of the sisters or another bride from Spain would be where it would be the natural successor. But I think from a very early age, he would have known that this girl in Spain was going to be his wife. They did write to one another when they got a bit older, and were sort of conversing with one another a little bit, and with the families as well. So there was this relationship building there. But it was from very early on that he knew that he would be married to a Spanish bride, and particularly Catherine. I think for Henry, a Spanish alliance was a big deal. So to marry his son to a Spanish princess, albeit the youngest of the princesses, you know, she wasn't going to inherit anything on the Spanish mainland, but that link was worth far more than anything she could ever inherit. So it's a good deal for them.
You said that for the majority of Arthur's life, Ludlow Castle is his home from the age of 3. Was Arthur close with his family, or was he quite far away? You know, he didn't spend a lot of time with them.
Yeah, I think there's something to say that he wasn't able to have a close relationship because of that distance. But he would have come home quite frequently, actually. When you think about the transportation systems, they weren't great, but he would have come home for special events, for Christmas, for a New Year, any sort of big birthdays, static events that they wanted to show Arthur off. He would have to come back to London. So I think he would have spent a lot of time. If you added it all up, it would have actually been quite a lot of time in London, and it would make sense if he was sort of, if he bunked up with his brothers and sisters when he came to visit. That would make sense, rather than setting him up with his own place in London. It just, you know, and then he would get to spend time with his family. But I don't think there would have been a lot of opportunity. I think you're right there that they wouldn't have led lives that meant that they crossed paths. But I think there was links there for them that meant that they saw him as, you know, their big brother, the future king, the person that they had to support, the person that they were most loyal to. And regardless of whether or not he was physically there, he was still very much part of the family. So it's nice to just think of them being all together at Christmas or something like that. That would have been quite nice.
How did Arthur's childhood shape him for the future?
I feel that Arthur would have been a very, I think he's very much his father's son. And Henry, while he was sort of following around and giving Arthur this apprenticeship, was very much sort of teaching him the ropes. And the fact that Jasper was such a key role as well, that very much in that sort of family vein. But the childhood he had compared to his father, I think would have made him a lot less. So I've said before about Henry's suspicious nature and things like that. I think Arthur having this pretty stable, because up to his death, everything is quite stable. There's ongoing things, and there's threats, and there's pretenders and things like that. But when you look at as a family, as a dynasty, those years before Arthur's death are all building to something that is quite fruitful. And the fact that he has this marriage to Spain and everything seems to go well, and I feel like he would have been a really good successor to Henry, and he would have been very level-headed, unlike what we got, some might say. But I think his childhood is so different to the others because he doesn't have that instability that comes after Arthur's death. I think he would very much have been a Henry VII, but improved upon. I think that's the best way I can sort of explain it. But yeah, I don't think his childhood has anything detrimental going on in there. I think he's just a very typical Prince of Wales with with a lot of experience behind him. I think he does well. He's very popular in the Council of the Marches. He's very well respected, even at 15, 16. He's asked for his opinion. His rulings are given are treated as if he was an adult. So I think that gives you an idea of how he was as a person as well.
Yeah, I think one of history's biggest what ifs is if Arthur survived, what would have Tudor England looked like?
Oh, it's almost too tantalizing, isn't it, when you start thinking about it?
So you mentioned Margaret a little bit earlier on. So when was Margaret born?
Right, so Margaret comes in November 1489, and she's sort of she's 3 years basically between her and Arthur. She's born at Westminster in London. My guess is that Elizabeth's saying, "No, I'm not going away again. I want to stay where I know, and in my home. I don't want to go away." And there's no need to be quite as symbolic this time. We have our future King Arthur now. Everything else is just insurance policies, but they still do roll out the red carpet. Her christening is held at Westminster in the hall, and they bring up the font from Canterbury Cathedral, which is traditionally the one that heirs to the throne are baptized in. So they're making a point that she is just as much part of this lineage as everybody else. The whole noble sort of ranks, everybody comes to London for this. But equally, the day after Margaret's christening is Prince Arthur's investiture as Prince of Wales. So one could argue, which one did they coattail Margaret off Arthur, or was it the other way round? Because if everybody's in town anyway, let's get this done as well, and then everybody can get it, be home in time for Christmas, sort of thing. But they do go all out with Margaret as well. She is given everything, and her own household again, just like Arthur had been given. But as I say, Arthur's out at Farnham, and then not long after, he's then moved to Ludlow. So Margaret's household is completely separate from him. But what's interesting is that Elizabeth has a lot to do with both the children's households. She tends to pick the staff and things like that. And a lot of the staff that had looked after Arthur when he was a baby move over to Margaret. So he gets sort of more, because he's a toddler at this point. He doesn't need nursemaids as much. He doesn't need rockers or anything like that. Margaret needs those. So they come over to be in Margaret's household. But because, I'm guessing because it was Princess Margaret, a lot of Elizabeth's side of the family are more involved this time as well. So you've got her sisters coming to the christening and carrying Margaret through the procession and things like that. And they are also, sometime or other, overseers of Margaret's household for a time. And it seems to be a real family affair, whereas Arthur is very much, because it's a more statecraft situation with Arthur. We've got to keep him safe. We've got to be very aware of what his role is in future, whereas Margaret is a princess. And while she is important, she's not as important. So I think they've got a little bit more leniency with Margaret.
Was Margaret's education different to her brother's education?
It was to some extent, but she did share a lot of the same tutors and the same materials. So, because it made sense, if you've got a tutor in already, you might as well have everybody in the classroom. But because being a princess, she didn't have as much academic expectation. You know, they didn't expect her to be learning 6 languages and doing all this, that, and the other. But Margaret was naturally quite intelligent, and I think she would have wanted to have learned these things. So she would have, I think she would have relished the fact that she was able to have this opportunity. Perhaps that Elizabeth would have wanted, but it wasn't something that she was ever given the opportunity to have, because it wasn't until she was in her teens that her brother was born. And I think she was 12, 13. So she maybe she saw it as an opportunity to sort of right a wrong that was done to her. You know, she thought, no, the girls can do it too, sort of thing. But there were a little bit of differences, but I think that came more in the physical side of things. I mean, there wasn't much in the way of physical activity for royal children. It was seen as too risky and would affect their physical development. But as she grew up, Margaret was known to be a very good dancer, very good hunter, very good horsewoman. So she obviously had a certain amount of this kind of education, but there wasn't as much focus on that for her and her sisters as there would have been for the sort of male children like Henry.
Do we know if Margaret was close with her parents and her siblings when she was growing up?
I think we can safely say she was. Being the eldest daughter, I think she kind of took on a lot of the sort of caring roles for her younger siblings, because obviously if mum was in the city or away, Margaret's sort of in that sort of leadership role. But that being said, she was very much under her mother's mentorship, especially once she knew that she was going to be married and become Queen of Scotland. Elizabeth took it upon herself to teach Margaret the ropes, and she was often seen at the same events, doing the same things, having the same experiences of queenship. Again, as a sort of apprenticeship, a bit like what they were doing with Arthur. This time it was with Margaret, and it was her and her mother teaming up to do it. While there's very little to show how close Henry was to his children. You can kind of get impressions that because he was giving payments, he was letter writing, he was doing things like that. But I feel like Margaret's letters home when she goes up to Scotland give us an idea that she really loved her father, and she was going to really miss him when she knew she wasn't probably not going to come back. And it's heartbreaking in some ways because she's so young, but that gives you an idea that maybe of the children, Margaret's the one that has the most to do with her mother and father because of her being under her mother's wing. Maybe that's what brings her more into her father's sphere, and she has that relationship with him. But with her younger ones, I get the feeling that it was more Henry that was closer to the younger ones, with Margaret sort of taking a mother hen kind of approach to everything.
What was expected of Margaret as a Tudor princess?
So she was almost Elizabeth's proxy from quite a young age. If Elizabeth was in confinement having a baby, or she was not well for some reason, or if she was away doing one thing and they needed somebody to stand in, Margaret was the stand in. So she, from a very early age, I think it's about 6, we've got records of her handing out prizes at jousts and things like that. So she was part of court life. But that was the main aim of that kind of experience, was to get her profile out so that they could find her a good husband, make a good diplomatic marriage. And she would have known from a very early age that her purpose is to be a Tudor princess and then to be a future queen of somewhere. And that's what she was intended to do. I think because of Margaret's age, when everything happens with her mother and father and her brother, she would have been acutely aware just how important her role was as the eldest daughter. It was her job to steady the ship. And I think she took that role very, very seriously.
How did Margaret's childhood shape her for the future and being the future Queen of Scotland as well?
That's an interesting one, because obviously Margaret's time as Scottish Queen is quite turbulent, shall we say. um, but I think that eldest daughter thing is going to come back. That's what comes back to her. She saw how her role was so crucial. No matter what she was doing, she had an important role to play. And I think for some people, especially when she got to Scotland, that kind of rubbed people up the wrong way, especially once James had died and she was regent. She knew what she had to do. She knew, because she'd experienced it before. She'd been in that position before where the person above her was no longer there. And I think that growing up with that kind of, this could all end any second and I've got to bolster everything, I've got to steady the ship. That's what really, I think that's what Margaret took from her childhood, that, you know, her role was what she was put on the planet to do and she had to fulfill it.
So our third Tudor child is Henry, and we all know him very well.
Prince Henry. Oh, the thing is that when you're reading about him as a child, you almost don't recognize him. It's quite strange, because he's born in June 1491 at Greenwich Palace, which at the time was actually called the Palace of Placentia. So it was, they renamed it during Henry VII's reign, but at the time it was Placentia when he was born. And a third child, his christening was a big feast, big stuff, but it was kind of a bit, oh well, we know what's happening now. We're a bit used to it. It's a bit old hat. What I do find interesting is that it's most likely that his christening took place at the Church of the Observant Friars across the road from Greenwich Palace, which interestingly is where he married Catherine of Aragon. So he was christened in the same church, same chapel as where he married his first wife. So it sort of goes round in a circle. So yeah, he's an interesting one. I think it's the best way to put it.
Did Henry share a household with or like the same palace as his sister Margaret?
Yeah, they did. Basically, the when he was born, Margaret was still under 2. She was 20 months. So she would have still needed pretty much the same care. So I'm guessing the idea was keep everybody together, keep everybody safe, already have trusted staff. So put them all into a nursery, just like how Elizabeth was raised. Granted, with her, it was slightly different because it was all girls up until Edward. So they would have all naturally have ended up together anyway. But I think Elizabeth saw the benefits of having everybody together and raising everybody in this family environment. Plus, it all made sense, and we all know how Henry liked to not spend too much money if he could avoid it, especially on things that weren't nice and pretty. So they having them all in one meant that they only had one set of staff, one palace to have open at a time, everything like that. So, it's economies of scale, so to speak. But what's interesting is that in the records, once Henry's born, the household is referenced as the prince's household rather than Margaret's or the princess's household. So Henry is taking precedence over his sister by virtue of his gender. But immediately, it's his household now, not Margaret's. Margaret's not as important because she's only a princess. So that's, he is important because he's that spare, for want of a better word. He's literally their insurance policy, but it's his household now.
Madness. Give the women rights.
Exactly.
Was Henry close with his parents and his siblings?
Henry was, I hesitate to use the word definitely because we can't say that for sure, but we can see how close he was, especially to Mary, his younger sister. Later on, you see just how close they are. They very much sort of are. I think they are very, very similar people, and I think that they kind of clash a lot, as siblings do. But you can see just how much he wants to look after her and wants to protect her. I also feel like he had a lot of attachment to the other brothers and sisters that he had through the years. His other siblings, while they died very young, they did spend time in the nursery with him. They would have been around him, and I think that would have had a big impact on him. With his parents, everybody talks about how close Henry was with his mother, and I think you could say that there's some talk about how the fact that she taught them to write and things like that. But like I've said before, there was a lot of overlap in the staffing in the nurseries between Elizabeth and her children. So there's a high likelihood that, yes, she would have overseen these things, but equally it could have been the same people that taught her to write that taught her children to write. So it could be anything like that. But I do think that they would have spent a lot of time together. The palaces that the children were brought up in were not that far from London, and the king and queen would have been able to visit. They may well have visited quite frequently, especially when the children were a lot younger, and especially if Arthur was all the way out at Ludlow. Visiting the nursery may well have made Elizabeth feel a little bit better. At least she could see these children. She couldn't get all the way out to Ludlow every week, but she could get to Eltham or to Sheen or wherever it was. These palaces were all places she knew very well as well, so where she was brought up. So I think that would have given her a little bit of security and would have made her feel closer to the children. And with Henry, he very much oversaw the education side of things and tried to make sure that the children had the best of everything. I think that was the way he showed his love, was by providing and that stable environment that he hadn't had. So for little Henry, he's named after his father, so he's got that link, but he's also seeing that these people love me, they want me to do well, they want me to have these things, and I think that would have helped all of them to have a closer bond with one another. I'm not sure that they were particularly close as a family, though. I don't think any royal family would be sort of in each other's pockets.
You see sometimes that it's rumoured Henry was quite a spoiled child. Is this a myth or is it true?
I don't think that spoiled is fair. I'm not saying he wasn't. But I don't think it's fair to say that a royal male heir child with that privilege that brings and then say, oh, no, you're spoiled. I don't think it's very fair because he would have been raised to know that he's part of this divinely ordained family that's on the throne of England, and his brother's going to be king, and his role is going to be to back up his brother and be his defender, because that's what the Duke of York would do for the king. That's what his role is going to be as he grows up. But he would have had nice things. He would have had the best clothes and the best food and the best tutors that money could buy, because he was the king's son. But I also think that at a certain point, any spoiling or any privilege, or I hate to say it, but if he was acting in a way that just meant that he was just a spoiled brat, that ended so abruptly, because his death, the death of his brother, him then being given Prince of Wales, having to really turn around on a sixpence to say, no, you're the heir apparent now. You have to learn how to be king. You have to follow everything. You have to do everything. And then his mother dying, and then his sister going away. He didn't have time to be a spoiled brat. If he'd thrown a tantrum, it wouldn't have got him anywhere. And I think that alone means that, yes, all right, he was privileged, but I don't necessarily think that would have made him into a spoiled child. And I think that's, I said before that I don't, I never thought I would see the day that I'd be a Henry VIII apologist. But writing this and seeing him as a child, I kind of, oh, poor Henry. Oh, poor Henry. Oh, the poor boy. So it's sort of, it does make me think that, maybe he's a little bit, we need to cut him a little bit of slack. He has a lot to deal with.
What education did Henry receive? Was it similar to his sisters? Because he's quite intelligent, isn't he? It's quite obvious from a young age he's intelligent.
Yes, he takes on the same work that his brother's doing and just flies through it. Whereas Arthur is having to really work hard to get through all this. He's just like, oh yeah, I can read that. That's fine. What's slightly different for Henry over the others is that he is truly given a humanist sort of scholarship. His main tutor was John Skelton, who also taught Margaret and Mary later on. But the main other person in Henry's life was Arthur Plantagenet, and he was Elizabeth's half brother. But he was a proper sort of old-fashioned, almost chivalric knight, and he was the one that most likely took Henry and taught him things like horse riding and jousting and swords and everything like that. The proper boy things that you sort of associate with little boys growing up. So this combination of John Skelton's good base, sort of base knowledge of the classics and this humanism, which inspired him on an academic level. And then he's given this opportunity to do all these physical, amazing things that would be every little boy's dream, to go jousting. My goodness. Because it's unusual, because at the time that it wasn't expected that they would have this physical activity. So the fact that Henry's doing all of this, because he obviously, there's a overriding theme that he kind of needed that exercise. If he was in school today, he'd be given extra playtimes and fidgets and things like that to let his energy out. So it was good for him to do that, but it wasn't necessarily what was normal. So Henry's getting something slightly different, and I think that's the difference between him and his siblings, is that Margaret wouldn't have been getting that, Mary wouldn't have been Arthur wouldn't have been getting that, but Henry's out there riding his horses around and shooting arrows and doing all sorts of things.
How did Henry's childhood change when his brother died in 1502?
1502, yeah. It's unrecognizable from when you consider that in their wedding in the November, I believe, in 1501, he's dancing, he's making ripples because he's taking off his shirt and dancing with Margaret, and they're making a really big spectacle of themselves, and everybody's remarking on how flamboyantly he dances and how lovely they are and how England's future is golden because of all these wonderful Tudor children. To literally 6 months later, he has every freedom he's known up till that point taken away because he is the heir and he's the one. There had been Prince Edmund, who was born in 1499, but he died age 1 in 1500, so there was no other male heir. At one point they had 3, and now they had 1. So his all of the pressure and all the future hopes of England are now embodied in Henry, and he would have known that. He wasn't stupid. He would have known that all of that he'd seen his brother doing was now his responsibility. And less than a year later, his mother's death, alongside another baby sister at the same time. And then a few months after that, his big sister goes away to Scotland. There is literally him and Mary left. And he has got to shoulder everything. He has gone from he's this carefree child to this boy, future king, and it's unrecognizable, really is. I think again, it's poor Henry. You do feel sorry for him.
So you mentioned Mary there.
Mm.
When is Mary born, and do we know anything about her christening?
So Mary was born in the March of 1496. She is actually the 5th Tudor child, because Elizabeth gave birth to a 4th child in 1495. If I'm right. No. I'll get it right in a minute. 1492. There we go. And that was named Elizabeth. And she made up the foursome. She was the perfect 2 boys, 2 girls. Excellent. And she was, for what I can gather, she was the baby of the family. She was the favourite. But she became very ill in September of 1495 and died really suddenly. And she was given a huge funeral and buried at Westminster Abbey. She was really, really missed by everybody because she was the first loss that the family had really suffered. And to have a little girl die at 3, normally they sort of, think, oh, you can get through the first year. We should be okay here. And then so suddenly as well, the records show that it was instant. It was sort of a day and she was gone. So it was more likely to be something along the lines of sweating sickness that took her. Now, the dates kind of line up that Elizabeth was already pregnant when baby Elizabeth died. But sort of 8 months after Mary was born. And Mary is, while she's not a replacement for Elizabeth, she's seen as a hope for the family. She's got, there's a 5-year gap between Mary and Henry, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it is quite a lot developmentally. When she's a baby, he's starting to learn his schooling and things like that. And as she gets older, but Henry looks after Mary. And he becomes her little sort of protector almost in the nursery. And everybody always talks about how Mary is the everybody's favorite, the apple of everyone's eye. She was beautiful. She was funny. She was, and it may well have been that she was this tiny little girl and with a much older siblings, and consequently she was given more attention. It's the baby of the family situation going on with Mary, but she hadn't known what had happened up till that point. She was only 6 when Arthur, and then 7 when Elizabeth died, so she was a lot younger than the others and didn't have as much experience to call upon with these things.
Did Mary have a fragile health growing up?
That was an interesting question, because there are some things that say that yes, because we've got lots of notes and bills and apothecaries that are coming to visit and things like that. But in the same way that there's lots of questions about Arthur's health, we don't really have any evidence to suggest that they were visiting for a particular reason. In my mind, these bills, they seem to start happening more frequently after Elizabeth's death. So could it just be overcaution on the part of Henry VII? You know, he's only really got two of his children at home now, and he wants to keep them safe. They are too much. He's invested too much time. He doesn't want anything bad to happen to them, and I think it might just be for me. I don't think that there was anything wrong with Mary. I think that, in my opinion, there'd been that much loss and that much suffering. Henry, particularly, just wanted to protect his little family, what was left of it, and that may well have been. He always called on apothecaries and physicians whenever Elizabeth was pregnant, whenever there was something important happening. So he would have done the same thing for his children. I don't think that Mary was a particularly sickly individual.
You've said that Mary was close with Henry, especially. Was Mary close with her parents?
I think she would have been to a certain extent. I mean, she was only little when before, you know, sort of after leading up to Arthur's marriage and then his death, and she was only a little girl. But there's moments in the records that have her coming out to jousts and things like that, just the same way that her sister had done before. She was taking on courtly duties. And again, after her mother's death as well, she was brought in more to do things because Margaret wasn't there. She took up that mantle, which would have made her closer to her father, because obviously she was having to do more on his behest. It's an interesting thought that she was closer to her father than her mother. We talk about him giving payments and things like that, and he talks about having £100 a year allowance, which at that time, and those, you know, sort of early 1500s, £100 a year, just that's an extraordinary amount of money. And she, you know, it's ever likely people thought that she was his favorite and spoiled if that's what she was getting. But equally, Margaret had gone and was living in Scotland, and you know, there was nobody else to spend this money on. So, and she was having to represent the crown, so we need to make her look the part. So giving her lots of pretty dresses and spending lots of money on her was probably the way to do it.
Would Mary have received the same education as Margaret and Henry?
I think so. The tutors that they'd brought in for Margaret and Henry stayed on at the court for most of the time that Henry VII was on the throne. John Skelton particularly. But Mary seems to have spent a lot more time in her own little household. She had a governess as well, Joan Vaux, and she was responsible for her well-being, particularly after Elizabeth's death. So I think that having that female role model and having that person responsible for her was what they wanted for Mary, rather than having all male tutors around her all the time. She also had a little friend brought in, Jane Poppincourt, who was originally brought in as just a maid who happened to speak French, so they could practice their French together. So that was something a bit different. The others hadn't had as many sort of companions. Arthur had companions out in Ludlow, sons of Welsh nobles and allies of Henry's. The idea being that he would have those as allies when he became king. And Margaret and Henry had a few people, Charles Brandon being the most famous one that had been brought up around Henry VIII. But Mary was kind of left in isolation at the end, especially when she sort of became a bit older. So she had to have this sort of slightly different household around her. Interestingly, as well, that because she was on her own, she actually became really close with Catherine of Aragon, who had been, after her marriage to Arthur, she'd been left sort of, I don't want to say the word abandoned, but she had sort of been left behind in London without a clear focus of what to do. And she was only a youngster herself, and Mary and she became quite close. And Mary would have spent a lot of time with the Spanish household and with the Spanish ladies, who were very fashionable and very exotic and European. And I imagine that they would have been quite a good source of a mentorship, really, for Mary and how to behave and what she needed to learn. So I think she had a different experience of growing up in that royal household than her siblings did.
How did Mary's childhood shape her?
I think that's an interesting question, because I think it's very similar to Henry in some respects. Henry came away from his childhood with all this upheaval and all this abrupt change, wanting to control everything. That's the idea that you get with him. Everything he does because he wants to control the outcome. You know, he wants a son. He wants to be in charge. He doesn't want anybody to be making decisions for him. And I think Mary almost has a similar way of doing it, but I think she has a better way of doing it. she too is experiencing this constant change. The people that are supposed to be the consistent people in her life are gone, and she's just moving around from place to place. But she also has this dedication that her siblings have. You know, she has to be a princess. She has to look after her royal family. She has to do her duty. But she appears to have understood that it doesn't have to come at the expense of being yourself. And she expresses what she feels in front of the men in her life, which maybe the others wouldn't have. Maybe Margaret, that was what she did wrong in sometimes, was she didn't express herself properly. And Mary, you see from her when she was negotiating her marriage in France and things like that, she takes control where she can. And I think she's learnt that behaviour from seeing what others have had to put up with. And she's like, no, I'm not for me. I'm not having that. I am going to do better. And she's confident, I think, is the best way to describe Mary. She knows what she wants. It's interesting because when she was betrothed as a youngster to Charles of Castile, the whole thing fell through because Henry VIII didn't want to do that anymore, and they were at war with France, and the whole thing, it just didn't work. But she was forced to retract her marriage vows that she'd already done. And apparently she did it in such a way that everybody could tell that she wasn't happy about doing it. But she still did it. But she made it very clear that she wasn't happy about doing it. Charles also wasn't very happy. Apparently he took a bird out of a cage and plucked it and told his people on his council, you have plucked me, but bear in mind for the future I shall pluck you, because he didn't get to marry Mary. So this is the future Charles V. So he wasn't a man that you wanted to get in the way of, and apparently it was true even at a very young age. So, but Mary was no different. She made her feelings quite clear.
What was the most interesting thing about researching this book?
For me, I've always enjoyed the fact that these stories aren't necessarily the ones that you hear all of the time. You know, you're familiar with the events that happen, especially after Henry VIII takes the throne. Perhaps you're aware of Margaret going to Scotland and the events that happened up there. You may be aware of Mary going to marry the King of France and then coming back and marrying Charles Brandon. You know, if you've watched the Tudors or anything like that, that's a very familiar set of stories. But seeing the stories and how these familiar people all grew up together and interacted with the outside world as well. My book that I did previously on Margaret More Roper talked about Thomas More's going to Eltham Palace to meet the children. And it's really interesting that I got to read it from the other perspective this time. I got to see how Henry reacted to having these scholars in front of him and how impressed they were with him, but how he wasn't actually very impressed with them because they didn't bring any work with them for him to study and things like that. You know, it's I think putting real personalities to these people that are so famous, and also finding the stories of the babies. I think we forget that they were there and they were part of this story. Losing two siblings at a young age must have had a bearing on the Tudors that survived. It can't not have. And I think when you consider that Henry lost 3 siblings in infancy and childhood, when you look at how he responded to his own children later in life, you think, oh, maybe that might be something to do with it.
Towards the end of the podcast, I like to ask my guests 5 fun history questions. And the first question is, have you got a history pet peeve?
I couldn't think. I got 2 because there's 2 that come straight to my mind. The first one goes back to when I was at university the first time round, and I was studying the 14th century and all of its loveliness. And I was getting so mad, and it has stuck with me ever since. People calling it's the Black Death or it's the plague. It's not the Black Plague. It's like it's one or the other. It's not both. It can't be the Black Plague, because which one is it? Which one are you talking about? And it's stuck with me ever since. And sometimes I see people referring to one, the 14th century Black Death as the Black Plague, and I'm like, no, I don't know. I can't cope with that. The other one is one that I've talked about quite often, is the fact that if I could go back in time, I would hand every single noble family in the country a big book of baby names and tell them, you're free to choose whatever you want. It doesn't have to be Margaret or Elizabeth or Thomas or Henry. There are more names in the world. It's so nice when you see new ones cropping up. It's like, yay. But no, that's the thing. When you're doing the research you're trying to trace family trees and you've just got this long line of Thomases, or even worse, if they have children that maybe they die in infancy or something like that, but they just keep renaming their children the same name in the hope that one makes it through. That's even worse.
If you could invite any historical figure to a dinner party, who would it be and why?
I was wondering whether I could change the rules just slightly, and instead of them coming to me, maybe I could go to them.
Okay.
Because I would love to go to a dinner at Thomas More's house, because they used to have, every member of the family used to come in and sit down for dinner. And if you were staying at the Moore house, you came to dinner, and they had these big discussions. And there's many letters talking about the fact that, they'd read us a few lines from the Bible and discuss, or they'd talk about something that happened in Parliament that day, or any number of things, any philosophical questions or anything like that. So, and have it being at that table, especially around 1532 when everything was kicking off a little bit, and he was trying to decide whether or not to stay on and all this kind of. I'd love to have been that's the kind of dinner table I'd like to be at.
Have you got a favourite historical book? It can be fiction, non-fiction, or both.
For me, for a non-fiction, I have a copy of Tudor England by John Guy, which has been with me since my very first day in my undergrad degree, and it still sits on my desk. Unfortunately, I'm not on my desk right now, but it still sits. And every time I start anything new, that's the first book I pick up. So it is. I consider that my favourite book on my desk. For for fiction, sorry, I always go back, and what makes me smile is my very first proper historical fiction book that I read. It was Yes, Mama by Helen Forrester, which is not in the period that I'm in. It's a Victorian book. But I read a lot of Helen Forrester when I was at school, and but Yes, Mama I'd already read before we read Tuppence to Cross the Mersey, which was the one that everybody read at school. And I just remember reading Yes, Mama, and I've read it 4 or 5 times now, and it's amazing. So that's the one I'd always pick.
If you could go back in time to any historical event or day, when would it be and why?
This one was really hard to ask. I was asking my children, like, come on, help me. I think I settled on Arthur and Catherine's wedding.
Hmm.
I think I'd like to be a guest at that and see just how magnificent everything was laid out and how they were dressed. Because you can read the documents, but you don't have every detail. And just to be present at this, what promised to be the dawn of the next sort of era of English history. I think that's a proper watershed moment. I think I'd like to have been there.
And finally, have you got a favourite historical fact?
This one's my favourite at the moment. It does cycle through. I do have quite a few. I normally sort of yell them at my children, and they're just like, "That's not interesting, Mum." But at the moment, because I'm researching a lot of Scottish history at the moment, and it's a did you know Scottish history? They had 200 years of Scottish monarchs who all succeeded the throne as children. So they went from 1406, when James I of Scotland succeeded at 12 years old, all the way through to James VI, who succeeded in 1567 as a 1-year-old. So you had almost 200 years of this. There was no stability whatsoever, and you kept having this minority rule in Scottish history. And it's like, the more you think about it, the more you think, oh my gosh, yes, that's right. Oh my gosh, yes, that's right. So you've got James II, he succeeded at 7. James III was 9. James IV was 15. They nearly got there with that one. James V was a year. Mary Queen of Scots was only 6 days. So it's, the more you think about it, it's like, oh my gosh, yes, they did do that. That's why Scottish history is so fluctuating, especially in that period. It's like, oh my gosh, no wonder Henry VIII desperately wanted to get Edward to a majority before he died.
They're all kids.
Yeah. Wasn't there that quote? It's like, woe to the country that has a child on the throne or something. There's a quote, Bible quote, that says that, and we all know how into his theology Henry would have been, so he would have been very aware of that.
Thank you so much for coming on today and discussing your book, which is releasing next month. It has been a pleasure to speak to you.
No, thanks ever so much, Jess.
Thank you for listening to Her Story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.